I was shocked by what I saw in the afterlife when I ended up there. Everything I learned during that experience so amazed my imagination that I simply have no right to hide it from the living. That is why I will do my best to convey to those who remain on earth the truth about how the other side is arranged. Most importantly, I will share details that, for some reason, everyone else has been afraid to speak of. That is how the most incredible message began, transmitted from those realms of existence where the living are forbidden to go. It was conveyed by a man named Thomas Lawrence, a well-known archaeologist and traveler. During his lifetime, he had an impulsive temperament, loved freedom, and adored anything that allowed him to feel the rush of strong emotions. So it is not surprising that he was very fond of riding his motorcycle at high speed. Unfortunately, what brought him such joy was also what destroyed him. On May 13, 1935, he had a terrible accident. That day, Lawrence climbed onto his trusty iron steed and, unsuspecting, set out for a ride along a road where almost no one usually traveled. He was racing at top speed down the highway when suddenly he saw some bicyclists appear out of nowhere. In an attempt to swerve around them, he lost control and crashed. Doctors fought for his life for a long time. The struggle with death lasted several days, but sadly, the doctors were unsuccessful. On May 19, Lawrence passed away, and at that point, his story could have ended. However, 3 years after his death, Thomas Lawrence unexpectedly made contact but from the other side of our mortal existence. Suddenly, he began transmitting his messages from another world through a woman named Jane Sherwood, who possessed mediumistic abilities, specifically the method of automatic writing. Later, these records were published in the form of a book titled The Posthumous Diary of Thomas Lawrence. What he reported in it is astounding and makes one wonder why all those who have returned from the afterlife fear speaking about the topics he addressed in his posthumous diary. Why do they not talk about such important details regarding the existence of life after death? After all, that could clarify a great deal about how the other side is structured and would give living people a clearer understanding of how their earthly life influences the further existence that begins when the soul leaves the physical body. The first message that the medium woman recorded began with these words: "Upon finding myself in the afterlife, I decided to keep my posthumous diary so that I could tell about the survival of my consciousness after death. Perhaps this account will induce someone still living to rethink their materialistic philosophy of life and finally turn their attention to the undeniable facts of spiritual existence. Moreover, I intend to share some important details about the organization of another sphere of the universe, details that, before me, no one has yet mentioned in their posthumous writings." Thomas Lawrence also conveyed information about how his own transition to the other side took place and what unexpected ordeals he had to go through there. Here is how he himself described it. "I remember the crushing blow at the moment of the crash, after which came emptiness. I cannot say how long I remained in that emptiness before a single point of my consciousness emerged there and gradually started to expand. I saw neither darkness nor light. Everywhere there was an endless grayness in which my anxiety grew." Thomas Lawrence then awakened in a formless world where he seemed to be the only inhabitant. He heard muffled voices and saw occasional shadows, but he could neither make out the words nor understand to whom those dark silhouettes belonged. Lawrence tried calling out for help but received no answer. Then he thought he fell asleep. In that sleep, the men saw the bicyclists who had caused his death, along with the road and his home. From that moment, in reverse order, the events of his entire life began to play out before him. They swept through his consciousness at incredible speed, yet he still managed to relive everything. This life review ended at the point where he saw himself as an infant in an unconscious state, when he did not yet have a single thought. After that, everything around him faded, and Thomas Lawrence's consciousness went completely dark, or so it seemed to him. Here is how he himself spoke of that period of his afterlife. "I cannot say how much time passed after this break, but when I came to my senses again, I was amazed that my life continued, albeit in a completely different form. I found myself in a strange wasteland shrouded in gloomy autumn twilight. It is hard to guess how long I stayed there, maybe weeks, months, or even years. Although I would not be surprised if only a few seconds had passed. Time in the afterlife has no meaning. But what shocked me most of all was that the familiar world I knew had completely disappeared, and everything around seemed like a nightmare. I waited to wake from it, but instead my conviction grew that I was dead. Previously, I believed that death would be the end of everything, that I would simply fade out. I am glad I was mistaken, though I must admit that what was happening to me on the other side of mortal existence terrified me because I had no idea what to do next or what was going to happen to me. After some time, the fog cleared a little, and Thomas Lawrence began to make out indistinct outlines of buildings, trees, and fences. He thought he saw a city and wanted to head toward it. Just by thinking about that city, he discovered he was quickly approaching its outskirts. Thus, Thomas Lawrence received his first clue that thought influences movement in that world. This is how he described it in his messages from beyond. I saw rows of tiny, shabby houses, a bleak chapel, and people. I decided to approach someone from the local inhabitants, but the faces of the passers-by showed no hint of friendliness. So I just kept going, depressed by my solitude. The more my loneliness and fear grew, the more threatening the surrounding world seemed to me. I wanted to leave that grim place and return to the crash site. Right at that moment, for the first time in this other realm, I finally felt a friendly presence. Soon I distinguished words spoken close to my ear. "Do you need help?" asked a voice in the fog. Thomas Lawrence saw the figure of a man who introduced himself as Mitch. Mitch said his duties involved working with new residents of the spiritual world, and then explained to the bewildered newcomer, "You must have been in a terrible state of mind before you ended up here. That explains why you woke up in this part of the afterlife. I'd like to help you, do you mind?" Of course, Thomas Lawrence did not mind, and this guide promised to take him to a better place. As they walked, Mitch explained that now Lawrence's body was made not of matter, but of emotions, so all joys, as well as sorrows, were felt more sharply there. Lawrence learned that in this new world, only what you can perceive remains in your awareness. Soon, the travelers arrived at a building, where Thomas was taken to a room full of beautiful flowers and light. There the guide explained that this place was somewhat like a terrestrial sanatorium, where newly arrived souls could rest and gather their thoughts before moving on. Naturally, Thomas Lawrence's adaptation to the afterlife was not as smooth as one might hope, because during his lifetime he had treated everything related to life after death rather skeptically. And considering that he was a scientist, he was practically an atheist in his outlook. As a result, he was completely unprepared for what he would face on the other side. Here is what he himself wrote about this in his posthumous diary. "Over time, I learned to feel happy here. But first, I had to endure the suffering of those people I had harmed while I was alive. What tormented me most was an incident during the war years when I caused the death of a man. Now I had to endure everything I made him go through back then. At the time, I thought I wouldn't be able to bear it, but now, little by little, I feel that my pain is subsiding." Thomas Lawrence insisted that the moment of atoning for all one's sins is one of the most crucial stages of adaptation in the afterlife. No soul can bypass it except perhaps those who lived with very high spirituality and have nothing to atone for. Yet everyone else does get a chance to rectify the evil they committed. The guide named Mitch also told Thomas Lawrence that in this new world, Lawrence needed to find a task for himself that would promote his enlightenment and salvation on the difficult path to purifying his soul of sins. Thomas Lawrence decided to help the new souls who, after death, found themselves in the same situation as he once did. However, he soon realized that you can't help everyone. This is how he described one such case. "One day, I met here a friend of mine who had committed a very grave sin in life. He was in one of the darkest spheres of the afterlife, in some sort of stupor. I was told that he might remain in this state for a very long time and that nothing could be done about it. In that condition, he deprives himself of the company of his loved ones, who are also in the spiritual world. Until he begins the path of ascent toward the light, there can be no reunion. I was also warned that such souls remain in this sort of coma until they finally awaken from their gloom, and only then can they begin the process of complete purification and, consequently, ascend to the higher spheres of existence. Besides helping new residents of the other world, Thomas Lawrence traveled and searched for those he had known in his earthly life. Sometimes he succeeded, and such reunions brought joy and warmth to his soul. But he warned that in reality, it is not as simple as it may seem, because people are very different and therefore dwell on different levels of the afterlife, levels that cannot always be crossed. The farther apart they are in terms of spiritual vibrational frequency, the fewer chances they have of meeting. In other words, if some of your loved ones reside in the lower realms while you immediately ended up in the higher planes, it is unlikely you will be able to meet, and not because someone will not allow it, but simply because the difference in your own vibrations will not let you see one another. Sadly, returning messengers from the afterlife remain silent about this, and quite in vain. If people knew this in advance, perhaps they would strive together to live virtuous lives, thereby increasing their chances of being together after death as before. In one of his messages from the other side, Thomas Lawrence said, "Hunger and thirst, day and night, cold and heat, suffering, they are all gone. There is no more struggle for survival. I am no longer afraid of death because it doesn't exist. That fear should be cast aside by those who still live on earth. Nevertheless, they must know that in the other world, we can rely only on what we achieved during our earthly existence. In the afterlife, we simply consolidate our earthly accomplishments. We can no longer add to our growth. I am deeply convinced that people should be aware of what awaits them in the other realm. Therefore, scientists need to pay close attention to this question and devote their efforts to a thorough study of life after death. The fog of ignorance about the other realm must give way to true knowledge of it." Thomas Lawrence also emphasized that life in the afterlife is not as easy as it might seem at first glance. No one is automatically happy there simply because they have shed their physical body. Of course, someone who suffered severe pain may initially feel great relief, but it must be understood that even in the other world, you still have to make efforts in order to end up in a place we might call paradise. Only a person's spiritual qualities serve as the key and pass into higher realms. Yes, there are none of the material problems familiar to the living. However, someone who neglects spiritual development can still create difficulties for themselves in the afterlife if they continue to cling to an egocentric view of life. On earth, punishment for sins does not come immediately in the other world. However, everything happens instantaneously. So the best thing you can do on earth is to cultivate your spirituality and realize your natural talents as much as possible, for they are essential tasks for the soul. It is also necessary to become a compassionate and empathetic person. If you remain egotistical and cynical, you will have to start all over again in the afterlife, and that is a fate one would not wish on anyone. On the other hand, those who have already lived by spiritual aspirations during their earthly existence will continue their journey after death. Before them will open such astonishing secrets of the other side that, at first, they will seem like a real fairy tale, but in reality, that will be the truest form of existence.